Barney. Hi everyone. Just before I start with the introduction, I'm taking you through a few housekeeping notes. We're going to start with the presentations. After my introduction, Paul Chernick will take over, followed by Tony. We have dedicated time for Q&A at the end of the session. If you want to read through the presenters' biographies, you can do so on the event registration page and Eventbrite addressed here. Please make sure that your microphones and cameras are turned off throughout the webinar. As I said, please use the chat function in the Zoom to post your questions throughout the session, and we'll go through them at the end of the session when we're doing the Q&A. And as Barney mentioned, the session will be recorded. Welcome everyone to SPE London Coffee Hour on Scope 3 emissions and offsetting. Today, in this dynamic webinar series, we are shining a spotlight on a topic that often flies under the radar: the critical significance of Scope 3 emissions and the effective offsetting. Our esteemed speakers for this engaging coffee hour include Paul Chernick, ERC Evolution General Manager. Paul launched ERC Evolution as an internal startup within the ERCE group in 2021. He did so in the belief that to achieve climate mitigation ambitions, technical and commercial specialists from all industries must be brought together to collaborate and share knowledge. With years of experience as a resource specialist, certifying independent studies in CCS and oil and gas sectors, Paul's expertise expanded into climate disclosure, where he drives innovation to meet the demand of this field that bridges stakeholder financial data and climate information. Joining him is Tony Griffiths, CEO and Technical Director of AllSites. AllSites is a UK-based clean energy data visualization and application developer, creating affordable web-based tools to allow quick decision-making, aiding the energy transition challenges. Tony has 25 years of diverse global experience in energy industry and have been a chartered chemical engineer for over 20 years. He's on a mission to demystify complex clean energy development decisions and help authorities, energy developers, investor consultants, and other decision makers to make the best use of limited resources, with focus on real science-based decarbonization impact. So now, without any further ado, I pass this over to Paul. Paul, feel free to share your screen and let's get this started.
All right, thank you, Miriam. Please let me know when you can see that. Hopefully it's working.
Yeah, I guess we can see your screen. That's perfect.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. Hope all is well today. Just got to show up the general disclaimer as required. So why am I here today? So ERCE, as Miriam mentioned, we have a division of our company focused on climate and sustainability. And one of the topics that we work on is GHG emissions, in particular GHG emissions disclosure. So within that, there's two main areas. One's preparing for disclosure and getting your inventory in place. And then the second half of it is having somebody come in and do third-party verification. So we work on both sides of the coin, depending on which client we're working for. So just to give a bit of background, we've been working with clients as this industry has been evolving over the past few years. On the oil and gas side, examples you may be familiar with is our work with Tailwind or IPC. And we've also done advisory work for people like Gulf Keystone, but we've also been working in other industries like the waste industry, manufacturing, and several private equity groups out of New York that like to keep themselves confidential in terms of their names, but we've been working with them to understand how they change their investment strategies depending on the emissions intensities of the various portfolio companies. So it's an industry that's growing and going to grow in the future. So jumping straight into Scope 3, basically, why should we care today? Why is scope 3 important? And as we'll learn as we go through my quick talk today, scope 3 is where corporations use their power as a consumer and as a product designer. And importantly, what's happening is there's new laws being passed all around the world. The first one came into effect last year with the EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, in terms of a law that covers all areas of sustainability. In the UK, if you're a listed company, your firm's probably been dealing with this for a few years, as the financial conduct authorities had rules reporting using TCFD, so the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. New laws are about to come into effect in the UK with respect to some new standards that are coming out later this year, or have come out this year and going to go into regulatory effect later this year. And the USA is also looking to adopt TCFD as a reporting standard. So basically, what's happening is companies for years got to report scope 3 as a voluntary activity. It's something they got to choose to do. We're now seeing a world where that's no longer voluntary, but it's an obligation as part of your corporate disclosures. So this is now a need as opposed to an option. So you've probably all seen this slide or a variant of it many times over the years. But what are scope 3 emissions? And effectively, they're everything that happens upstream and downstream of your company. So if you're working oil and gas, you're really familiar with scope 1. You have to report that often as part of the EU ETS system. And if you're an operator, you have to report the emissions that are directly related to the operations you control. Scope 2 is the emissions associated with utilities, the purchase of electricity, steam, and cooling that you use for your company. And then scope 3 is basically everything else. We'll get into a little more detail about that later, but this graphic is good. It's from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and it just shows the kinds of things that are upstream and the kinds of things that are downstream. If you work in oil and gas, the big one that's quite controversial is use of sold products. So how oil and gas products are used in the reporting of this. If you're in the upstream, some of the things that could be complicated is your capital goods purchases. So how much embodied emissions are inside that FPSO that you just purchased. So it can be complicated or looks complicated, but as I said, it's now an obligation. And one of the interesting things is one of the upcoming rules looks like you're going to have to report the embodied emissions associated with the burning of your proved reserves. So for those of you who work in oil and gas, this will be quite a thing going forward. So in terms of getting into a little more of the detail of scope 3, we have some examples here. And what the objective is every company has to report what's termed their material scope 3. So nobody cares about every individual pencil that you purchase, unless you're a pencil manufacturer, but they do want you to identify what your material scope 3 is. And the problem with the word material is that the obligations pass back to the company to decide what's material. So you basically need to go through your sources of scope 3 emissions, and you need to decide, well, what's material to your business. It's slightly different than a life cycle emissions analysis associated with a product. So quite often you'll hear these terms like your carbon footprint of your product, and that is the specific journey of a specific product that you might manufacture, for example. So carbon footprints are a really big thing for manufactured goods. But scope 3 also considers the electricity to power your office. It considers things that aren't specific to any individual one product, but the company as a whole. So basically you need to go through these, and you need to basically check each one to know which one's material, at least at a high level, and then dig into the details of what you want to disclose on the material ones you select. So your average business, office-based business, your material scope 3s will be things like office commutes. There'll be things like transportation, like flying. But if you're a the company that manufactures, say, steel pipe, it'll be obviously the purchase of the steel and the transportation of the steel, and the emissions associated with the creation of that steel, as well as the shipping of the products to the stores or to market afterwards. So it really varies from business to business. So if we get into the calculation methodologies, as you get into the details of this, what you'll find is that there's a bunch of different techniques. There's different software that do it. You can purchase some really great SAP-based software tools. You can find Excel-based software tools. If you work in oil and gas, there's tools generated by the API Institute. So there's lots of different tools out there. But ultimately, they come down to 4 primary methods. The first one is a supplier-specific method, where you would go to, say, Dow Chemicals, and they would give you the scope 3s associated with their information or their products, and you would go to each supplier, both upstream and downstream, and you would get the scope 1 and scope 2 emissions from that company, and their scope 1 and scope 2 is your scope 3, and you figure out what percentage is attributable to the amount of services you're buying from them, and you go from there. The second is a spend-based method. So there's a lot of emissions factors that are associated with the amount of money you spend buying products, and the emissions associated with that degree of purchase. The third one is, again, it's emissions factor-based method, but it's based on units of mass of purchased goods, so tons of steel or pounds of grain or whatever it is that you buy, and there's an irrelevant emission factor associated with that. And then we find most of our clients end up using a hybrid method. So they'll use a combination of 2 or 3 of these, where they can get some supplier-specific data, usually for their material purchases, but then often they have to use emissions factors or secondary data to complete the circle. So the really important thing about all of this is to remember that scope 3 is a best efforts exercise. So unlike scope 1 and scope 2, where in scope 1, theoretically, you know everything about your business, so you should be able to be quite accurate about the emissions associated with your business. You know how much fuel you purchased, you know how much electricity you purchased, you know where you purchased it from, so you can get quite accurate. Or scope 2, where again, you can set up particular plans, and you can get that sorted with your utilities companies. In scope 3, there's always an error bar. But the important thing to understand with scope 3 is that you're basically showing year-on-year changes. So if you have a consistent methodology, what you're looking for is year-on-year improvement, or in some cases, worsening. Say your business is growing, so your absolute emissions of scope 3 go up, but perhaps your intensities go down. And so what people are looking for in the reporting of these to markets is they're saying, come up with a systematic way of presenting your scope 3 emissions, and then show us how it changes year over year as a result of your business. And then this in turn builds into this whole concept of climate risks and opportunities. So for those of you that are familiar with the TCFD reporting, it's all about this concept of climate risks and opportunities. And then you start to get into, well, where are your risks in your supply chains? You know, if a business is based in a country where they have an increasing carbon tax, for example, in Canada, we're going to have an increasing carbon tax over here. So if you have an increasing carbon tax, that may cause certain members of your supply chain to have to leave the country. If you understand their emissions, you can begin to understand what the risks are associated with their business, and you can begin to judge whether that's going to impact your business going forward. So these concepts of climate risks and opportunities come into play as you begin to understand the emissions and the impact of climate policy on your supply chain, both upstream and downstream. So that's where I'll conclude for the moment and pass it over to Tony here. But I just wanted to say that I'm really sorry it's me talking today. It was supposed to be my colleague Ruha Hussaina, who joined us, as Mariam said at the beginning. We look to make a multidisciplinary company, and she joined us from the steel industry. And obviously, the steel industry being a major source of emissions in the world has a slightly different view to oil and gas. And so when we brought her in, she brought a wealth of knowledge, and she gives her apologies she can't be here today. So over to Tony.
Thank you. All right, let me try and share my screen. Okay, can I just check, are you able to see that okay?
Yeah, that looks good. Thanks, Tony.
Brilliant. Okay. No, thanks for having me on today. So I think some of the things that I'll share with you, I think follow on quite nicely with what Paul's talked about there, kind of more from a regulatory aspect. So let me start. So just by the way of introduction, so Mariam's already introduced me. Thanks for that. I will start off and say, I guess my own disclaimer, you know, I'm not a specialist in any way in formal scope 3 calculation methodologies or offsetting. But what I will talk about is, I think my own perspective on, I think how I've learned enough about the subject to take some appropriate action. And I know Paul talked there about best efforts, you know, to best efforts endeavor. It's not a perfect science. So what we've gone through is very much a best efforts exercise on our own company. So just to frame that with I guess my own career summary, yeah, Marian talked about, I worked in oil and gas for 25 years. So I've been a chartered chemical engineer for quite a long time. And a lot of my career has actually been calculating, you know, reporting, forecasting, kind of, you know, oil and gas and carbon production numbers and emissions and what impact they have. So that's been very much part of my background. Later on in my career, you know, I kept on having this observation that, you know, why is it that organizations full of clever, experienced people quite often make terrible decisions? That really fascinated me. So I did an MSc in operational research, which for those of you not familiar, that's the science of decision making. So I'm really interested in blending, you know, technical aspects and things with, you know, how do people make decisions around that. So I left the oil and gas industry in 2020. That was during the first COVID lockdown, and that really was an opportunity for me to co-found a business with my wife Rosie. And what we wanted to do is use my background, you know, my technical and kind of organizational background to help organizations speed up good decisions for accelerating real decarbonization. So I think that's kind of relevant to today's session. Yeah, so what I want to really give you today is you know, our perspective of a business owner, and I've used that word, purpose-driven business owner. So you'll see a little tag on the right-hand side there. So that's the symbol for a B Corp. For those not familiar with that, B Corp, it's kind of regarded as the gold standard for business governance and how an organization treats its stakeholders, including employees and environment and planet. So we've gone through the B Corp exercise and we're certified. Yeah, I don't mean for that to sound self-righteous in any way, but that's just the way that we've deliberately set up a business. We want to have a positive impact on the world. So 4 things I'll cover briefly today then. So I'll talk about our own experience and what I understand are company challenges for managing scope 3 emissions. I'll then go on to talk about our experience and challenges with managing offsets, that they're related but different. I'll talk a little bit about tools to help understanding for some of the numbers. And then I'll just close out with a summary of some of these and some closing thoughts. So if I So maybe if I just explain what our company does. So we make digital products. We don't burn anything. We don't make any physical products. So when we look at our emissions, the bulk of it is scope 3. And I'd regard scope 3, really is the impact of a business. So we knew already that a scope 1 emission was nothing because we don't burn anything. Scope 2 fairly small because we only use a limited amount of power for the business. But then when it comes to trying to calculate the scope 3, that's quite a complicated. That's quite a complicated exercise. So Paul's described, really what scope 3 includes. The way that we went about this was that we used a piece of software called Climate Essentials. So this is developed by a company in West London. They're kind of neighbours to us. They're called Climax Community. And this piece of software was actually promoted quite nicely by West London Business. They'd done a survey of carbon emission reporting tools that were kind of appropriate to small and medium-sized businesses, and this was recommended. So we used it. What was quite good about it is that it kind of forced you to identify, what is that data collection that you need to make to enter into the calculation. So the kind of things that you have to work out as a business is, how much are you traveling? So how much are your employees driving around, getting trains, flying? How many company lunches are you providing? Even down to who's working from home, and what's their energy usage at home whilst they're working from home? How much waste, both recycled and general waste has been generated, and how much water you're using. And obviously, a lot of this stuff, a company won't have records of these, so you need to make assumptions that you believe are best efforts. So that's what we did. So I would say, in the scheme of things, our company activities are very small. I think in relative terms, what we went through was pretty simple, but still, involved quite a lot of steps there. So what I've shown on the left-hand side and at the bottom, this is really the output from the calculations that we did. These are calculations that we did last year for the year before. So I would summarize that and say scope 2 was about one ton per year. Scope 3 was about 6 tons a year. So overall about 7 tons a year. It's very small, but we were able to pin a number down on that, and then use that as a basis for offsetting. I guess the other thing I'd say, I guess our company operations, we deliberately try to not fly. We try to not travel really unless there's a big benefit in traveling. We generally try to not have an impact unless there's a really good business need to do that. And I think going through this number exercise just highlighted our minds that when you do create waste and buy things, and maybe buy printers or computers that you don't need, this all adds up to the bottom line. So that was our experience with trying to work out our own scope 3 emissions. I can imagine that as you go to bigger companies, particularly oil and gas companies or service companies that have got complicated supply chain, long supply chains with large numbers of materials being used that have come from all over the place, this becomes a very complicated exercise. What I've attempted to do here is just to assemble the kind of challenges that an organization would have. And I must admit to kind of cheating a little bit. So I just got ChatGPT to use its knowledge of tens of millions of documents to tell me what the main issues are. And I think some of them Paul's already touched on. I've witnessed them. So complexity and scope of business activity, that's a big one. I think hand in hand with that is data availability and data quality. Lots of things going on, it's quite difficult to get that. Scope definition, so I think that definition of what's in or out is a bit subjective. And then supply chain complexity. So I've kind of highlighted 2 in red there. So I'd say, these challenges that are highlighted red are really, these can only be fixed by leadership, by basically the people that run the company. So things like long-term commitment to emissions reduction, consumer and stakeholder expectations. These are issues that have to be dealt with and addressed, right at the top of the company. And if that's not in place, these won't be dealt with. So I think to summarize that, successful management and reduction of Scope 3 emissions often require a holistic approach, collaboration with stakeholders, investment in data and technology, and a clear commitment to sustainability goals. So, all this stuff's driven from the top. If I then go to our experience of managing offsets, I guess as an engineer, naturally, I'm kind of skeptical of, financial products that deal with offsetting impact. But when I did some research, there was one product that in particular seemed to be particularly well verified. It got very good impartial reviews and feedback. So it's called Ecology. And I think for small businesses like ourselves, very easy to use. The way that they view offsets is, if you identify a certain number of tons or 1,000 tons of CO2 that your business is emitting, you can offset that based on a certain price, and then what you're effectively purchasing is an investment in a carbon reducing project. So we just put in the last year 7 tons of CO2. It's very small. But what that did, that helped to finance, I think, wind farms in Honduras and Mexico. So these are carbon avoiding projects in developing parts of the world, where you probably get much more value for reducing that carbon than you would in spending that money in the UK, for example. Ecology price their offsets at about £9.45 per tonne. Which is quite low. That's like an order of magnitude lower than the carbon price, or what people regard as the carbon price. I point out that Ecology, they don't regard tree planting and nature-based solutions as being a verifiable CO2 avoiding offset. So they're really focused on things that displace fossil fuel, and methane. So I've just put in some snapshots there of how that interface works. But if anybody's looking to take action, I'd recommend Ecology as something that seems to do the trick. And then I guess the company challenges with offsets. I think a lot of them are similar to measuring and managing Scope 3 emissions. But there's a bit more here about behavioral change, rebound effects. So it's a rebound effect is, if you're offsetting it, psychologically, it can make you feel like you're kind of off the hook from taking real impact. So it can introduce complacency within organizations if you feel to be managing by offsetting. So if I summarize that then, so to address the challenges around offsetting, businesses must adopt a comprehensive and transparent approach to Scope 3 emissions management, work collaboratively with suppliers and partners, and consider a mix of emission reduction strategies and high quality offset projects, where I think the emphasis there is on high quality. So I wanted to talk a little bit about simple tools that can help people understand what carbon numbers mean. So I think what I see a lot is that these scope emission tools that can be quite complicated. Quite often you're having to gather tons and tons of data, go through, many pages and lots of people involved, and you put everything in, and then you get a big result out, and you possibly get limited insights from that about what making choices might actually do to a carbon emission. So one thing that we built a couple of years ago, so we built a unit converter anyway. It's just a simple web application. We did it originally to help people understand, conversion between volumes of hydrogen and heat units, for example, or different units of energy. But then we also built in a CO2 equivalent converter, or a CO2 rate converter. We used a bunch of factors that the IPCC, part of their work in 2014, they published. So they give factors for different forms of transport, how that relates to carbon intensity. So what that's allowed us to do, so for example, if you've got the option of flying to London, from London to Singapore, you're going to go to a conference, talk about carbon capture, that's like an 11,000 kilometer journey times 2. If you look at the impact, that's about 1.8 tons of CO2. So, armed with that information, you can then think about, well, if I've got an organization flying around, what does that do to my company metrics? You can actually make decisions based on that. It just becomes a bit more tangible. And then the example I've given below, very, very similar thing, but instead of flying, the example on the bottom there, that's the impact of, let's say, 10,000 miles a year driving in a diesel car. So 16,000 kilometers a year, that's about 2.2 tons a year of CO2. And then you can look at that in a different way. You can say, well, if I did that same mileage, instead of in a diesel car, if I did that in an electric car that was fed from the UK energy grid with average grid intensity in 2020, then that emission reduces from about 2.2 tons a year to about 0.6 tons a year. And then you can take that further and say, well, actually, if I got the train instead, and that train is fed by UK grid, it's even less than 0.1. So, these kind of very quick tools, you can put any number in that you want. You can look at, different numbers of kilometers a year, and you can just see, well, what does that actually mean in terms of tons a year? And, I believe these simple tools are quite useful just for sense checking numbers and making quick decisions, rather than going straight into complicated things. Another couple of examples I've got here on the bottom left, in fact, the two on the left, this is how much, what's your CO2 impact of running your house, for example, on electric. So if your house is running at 4,000 kilowatt hours per year, based on the 2020 grid intensity, that's about 0.9 tons a year. But actually, if you were to use that exact same amount of electric in 2030, if the UK meets its targets for decarbonising the grid down to 100 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, then your impact actually goes from 0.9 to 0.4 for doing exactly the same thing. So I think just thinking about some of these impacts and things in a broader way helps you make decisions about what you use. And I guess on the right hand side, we've also converted units that we're familiar with in gas processing into, well, what does that look like in terms of tons per year CO2? So I worked on an FPSO. They had a fuel gas rate of about let's call it 6 million scuffs a day. If you convert that to CO2 impact, that's 121,000 tons a year. So you can see that these become quite massive numbers. And 50 million scuffs a day, that's about 1 million tons a year. So there's a massive difference between I guess, an impact that a business has, running offices and driving around and actually dealing with large oil and gas volumes, which, we kind of know anyway, but this is a nice tool to illustrate the differences. So I think if I summarize this, I think in my view, inclusion of scope 3 is kind of essential, really, if you're looking to understand the impact of your business. I think it reveals the true impact. Everything we do has got some kind of emission impact. Even if it's low carbon, it's got an impact. But I think, as Paul's pointed out, for those really committed to reducing negative impact, there is help available in the way of, all manner of web-based tools. I think some are better than others. Some are designed for different organizations, but there's lots of help out there, a lot of really good tools. I would advocate starting with really simple tools to try and quickly make sense of what some of the numbers mean. Make sense quickly of things, take quick action, on things like transportation and supplies before diving into, complexity and real detailed accounting. So we know that measuring scope 3 for a business gets increasingly complex with the scale of operations and supply chain. And I found that even for seasoned energy professionals, it can be quite difficult to make sense of. So a rough rule of thumb, 50 million scuffs of gas. If you're burning that in a flare, or if you're selling that to a downstream company, that is equivalent to about 1 million tons a year of CO2. That's quite a big number. So if you're in the business of using or supplying large volumes of oil and gas, there's kind of not much that you can do there to really hide the scale of that impact, except maybe to hide it. I think on offsetting, I'd say offsetting should be treated with caution. I think once you've actually maybe done what you can in terms of real actions to reduce impact, it's relatively cheap to offset the rest. And actually, it's quite a cost-effective way to fund, high impact carbon reducing projects in part of the world where it probably makes more sense to do that, rather than spend lots of money locally having a small reduction. So I think, offsetting can be a good thing as well. And that's my summary. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony. Thanks, Paul. Very interesting talk. So we've got a few questions in the chat, so I'm gonna read through them. And so the first question is from Lester. So how are IFRS S1 and S2 changing the reporting requirements and reporting complexity?
Do you want me to take this one?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so what Lester's referring to here is this new International Sustainability Standards Board, or the ISSB. So they're a new division, well, actually not that new anymore. They were created in COP26 as a way of trying to gather together a lot of the efforts from different NGOs to create a unified sustainability standard for the world to use. Unfortunately, immediately after they announced ISSB, the EU announced its parallel effort, so they weren't able to get that worldwide unification, but it exists. So the new ISSB rules were published in June this year, if I remember right. I think it was end of June, and they're currently going through the process of being adopted in the UK as part of Securities Exchange Commission reporting. So there's a process happening right now in the UK with regards to that. There's also a similar process happening in Canada. The simple answer is it depends what you were doing before. So the point of ISSB was to combine things from different, the UN Global Compact and SASB and all these other different voluntary frameworks and bring them under one standardized system. So if your company was reporting beforehand, it was probably having to report to 3 or 4 different voluntary standards. And it may have been very complex. But what the ISSB has is it has a sector-specific guidance, and it has general guidance with regards to general sustainability, and then specifically with regards to climate. And as the UK adopts it, and my guess is they'll probably make an announcement around COP28 this year. But as the UK adopts it into securities regulation, it's probably going to layer on top of the current UK requirement for TCFD reporting. So you're going to have to do TCFD and ISSB. ISSB, especially if they adopt the sector-specific guidance, it has a series of box-ticking exercises you have to go through with regards to water and with regards to emissions on the climate side of things. And it's just going to be an extra layer that you have to go through. So the good part about it is if every company is required to do it, it will make comparing one company to another using tools like Standard & Poor tools and things like that much more reliable from company to company, because at the moment it's very difficult to compare what one company is saying to another. But it is going to add an extra layer of compliance. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but yeah, but expect it to happen later this year.
Okay, thank you so much, Paul. So next question. So I'm going to start with Tony, but Paul, feel free to give your opinion on that as well. So you mentioned that Scope 3 emission is kind of like a best practice, and there's always some error bars associated to that. So Barney is asking, what are these error bars on estimating Scope 3, and are there any systematic error to the low side?
Yeah, do you want me to have a go at that?
Sure.
So, I would estimate, for this kind of calculation, the error would be quite high, plus or minus 40%, 50%. And I think as you went through the calculation, you'd want to spend more effort on, I think those things that are having a bigger impact that maybe you can measure. So, if it's things like transportation or things that you're purchasing, you'd assume that you can have records for that, so you can reduce the error there. I think things maybe that are less important, water consumption, I found is kind of less important. You probably wouldn't put too much resource into trying to calculate that in an accurate way. I guess, I've been through exercises, in previous oil and gas companies where we've had to, estimate, the company's abandonment liability. So, all the cost of, decommissioning the wells and pipelines and, unhooking the FPSO. It's a really difficult calculation because there's, it's not just the cost, but it's also, well, how many things and what conditions that thing in. So, that's very much a best endeavor exercise. So I kind of regard Scope 3 as being the same. You do the best you can with the resources you have, and I think you target those items that are measurable and have the biggest impact, and you just accept that there's no bar. But I think instinctively, I would estimate that it's probably good to plus or minus 40%, 50%. That'd be my view.
I'll add to that. So emissions factors can be really, really high. So if you read the API compendium, some of the emissions factors are over 100% plus or minus. And that's because the range of say leaking from a valve can be very wide. It can be 0 or it can be quite significant depending on the operations of the field, and emissions factors are averages, so they capture some of the whole range. So emissions factors can, depending on which one, can be super big. Obviously, if you're getting a direct measurement, it falls down quite a bit. And then because it's Scope 3, it's not up to you to measure that, it's up to your supply chain to measure that. So it depends on the practices that they have. So as Tony says, it can be very wide, but the emissions factors are designed to be just averages, and so therefore they can capture the low side or the upside, depending on the problem on the supply chain. And that's actually what's leading to a lot of the questions that are coming. For example, US LNG coming into Europe. A lot of the companies now are actually doing direct measurements in the US using projects like this Canary project and things like that to actually directly measure them, because the error bars associated with the emissions factor methods were too high and causing a lot of problems with importing into the EU. So people are trying to clamp down on this.
Okay, very good. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Tony. So another question from Simon. So Paul, if you can take this one, and obviously Tony, if you have anything else to add, yeah, we'll be happy to hear your opinions as well. So with regards to leased assets, could the owner of an oil field being produced via a leased FPSO report the associated operating emissions as Scope 3?
The simple answer is yes. It depends on the lease agreement. So this is where you actually have to get your accountants and possibly your lawyers involved, because now this is regulated reporting as opposed to just voluntary reporting. And so it depends on whether it's an operated lease and the conditions of the lease. So if you're uncertain if it's an operated lease or not, you have to have a look into the details and make that call, because basically either you or the lease operator has to report it as a Scope 1, and then the other one gets reported as a Scope 3. So it just depends. Another classic one where you can have Scope 3, significant Scope 3, is if you pay a tariff to run your oil and gas through a host facility. So obviously you're not a working interest partner in the facility, but you just pay a tariff to run your oil and gas through it. That can be another major source of Scope 3.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, that was an interesting question to me as well. Thank you for your answer. Tony, if you want to add anything to that.
I guess in terms of impact, if you imagine that a lease FPSO that's been, custom built for that oil and gas development, but it's just been leased to you instead of purchasing, that is true impact that should be assigned to that project. And the impact would be massive. If you imagine, kind of two or 3 years worth of thousands of people in a shipyard all, beavering away to convert that vessel, it'll be a big impact. But I'm just wondering, maybe Paul can answer this, but I'm just wondering if, how would a reused lease FPSO or basically a reused FPSO, for example, be viewed in terms of emission reporting? I'd imagine that would be very beneficial compared to a new build.
Yeah, it depends. So Scope 3 often is the emissions associated in the year. And then you also have often the government now, as part of its legal commitment, like the NSTA has this new legal commitment to look at net zero 2050. So it's both maximizing economic recovery plus net zero. So if you're commissioning a field redevelopment or field development, they'll ask to look at your life cycle emissions associated with the project now. So that will include things like, are you reusing an FPSO or are you building a new one? But if you're just reporting Scope 3 for the year, it's just the emissions associated with that year. So if you've commissioned an FPSO to be built, the emissions in that year would be your Scope 3, the construction emissions. And if it took 5 years to build, then you'd have a 5-year schedule of construction emissions in your Scope 3, and then you'd have the operations. So it depends on what the purpose of the reporting is. I have noticed personally that companies that don't have that life cycle emissions associated with their project to present to the NSTA are being asked to go back and do it again. So it is becoming a real thing now to understand that life cycle emissions. But it depends on the purpose of what you're reporting the Scope 3 for.
Excellent, thank you. So I don't see any more questions in the Q&A box. But no, thank you, Tony. Thanks, Paul, for taking the time to do this. It was a very interesting talk. Thanks,
Sorry,
Paul.
Marianne, I think there was, Will had a question, I think. Or maybe, did we already deal with that one? How would you recommend the companies looking to... Did you deal with Will's one?
I cannot see.
Okay. It's a direct message. Let me read that one out.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Yeah, so so Will's asked, how would you recommend for companies looking to set targets for reducing emissions? What measures do you suggest?
Tony, do you want to take this one first, and I'll go after?
I think it depends on the company. I mean, I think, you know, you'd go after the low-hanging fruit. You know, are there, you know, you'd kind of want to look at it almost like a Mach curve. So, you know, are there things that would save you carbon but also save you money and don't impact on your business? You know, they'd have to be the things you go after first. You know, once you've dealt with that, you know, you go for the next emitting thing. So I think depending on the company, you know, if it's an oil and gas company, if you're a producing company, you know, it's probably methane emissions, I'd imagine. You know, it could be that, you know, that supply vessel trips. You know, do you need to make that many supply vessel trips, or do you need to make that many helicopter flights? And, you know, do all those people need to go to Singapore for that carbon capture conference? You know, these might be the things that you target as a starter. But I think it's just down to business activities and business priorities. So, you know, start with the biggest impact stuff that also saves you money, and then work towards the harder stuff year by year. I'm sure there's a better answer somewhere, but that, you know, instinctively that feels the way that an organization would go after this.
Yeah, and I'll add a little bit from my experience working with the clients. So if you're a growing company, almost ultimately your absolute emissions will go up year on year, just because you're getting bigger. It doesn't matter what you're doing, manufacturing, adding more people to your consultancy, growing oil and gas production. So it's difficult to have KPIs associated with reducing absolute emissions. Then you have a tendency to look at reducing intensities. And then you get to pick which intensities you're looking to really focus on. Is it scope 1? Is it specifically methane? Is it scope 3, etc.? So coming up with those KPIs of your intensities is important. If you're a shrinking company, for whatever reason, then absolute might be what you want to focus on instead. But it's important before you go to markets to define what your strategy is and whether that's what your stakeholders want or not. Because now companies are being held very tightly to their public statements about what they plan to do. And that will be part of the year-over-year reporting with this new ISSB, is going to be, you have to state what you're going to do, and then you're going to be judged based on your ability to meet those goals year over year. And so analysts are going to be looking at, are you lowballing relative to your average industry trends? Are you a top performer? All that kind of stuff. And so it's going to become quite important to get those KPIs set up correctly in the next year.
Okay, I can see one more question from Barney. So when offsetting becomes cheaper than reduction of emission, does that set up a wrong behavior? How should we deal with that? And also, can companies bank offset when reporting their emissions?
So I'll take on that one a little bit. Don't forget, layering on top of this is also carbon taxes and EU ETS cap and trade emission schemes and things like that. So for large industry, it won't be cheaper to offset. Offsetting is actually will be how companies demonstrate corporately that they've done that last little bit, which is offset their irreducible emissions. But the cost of carbon is going to go up going forward. You know, it's already over 100 euros a ton for ETS. In Canada, it's going to be $170 a ton carbon tax Canadian. Sweden's already over 100 euros a ton carbon tax, Norway as well. So there's lots of ways that carbon costs or carbon is being priced. And then with the new EU carbon border adjustment mechanism, they're going to basically impose carbon costs on imported goods. So carbon's getting expensive basically through policy. But within the climate disclosure, so ISSB and TCFD and all these different acronyms, they're going to force companies to report what they're doing to reduce emissions before they offset. So companies are going to be held to the fire over what their emissions reduction strategy is first, and then they're going to have to rationalize that they've taken it down to the lowest that they can based on their business model that's economic. And then after that, they're allowed to offset. So you know, environmental agencies will be, and NGOs and stuff will be really monitoring this really closely.
Okay, thank you so much, Paul. Tony, I guess we still have time for you if you want to add anything on that.
I don't think I can add very much to that. Definitely agree that it should be, well, I mean, it sounds like it's going to be enforced anyway. You know, it has to be the last thing that you do. So it's not like, you know, it shouldn't be like putting money in the square box. But I think, you know, I think once you've got to that point where, you know, you've done everything in terms of real impact and real emission reduction that you can do, then that tail end of things that you can't necessarily reduce, or, you know, just not cost effective to reduce, then I think offsets can be the cost effective way of financing, you know, verifiable carbon reducing projects in other parts of the world.
And I'll just add one more layer. I mean, this year, what we'll see potentially is the London Stock Exchange will launch a voluntary carbon market. You've seen similar things happening in Singapore and places like that. And one of the things that's quite interesting is the Oxford University's published its principles of offsetting, which give different value to different kinds of offsets. So if Oxford's right, you should see some pretty big price gradients on the price of voluntary carbon markets or voluntary carbon credits, depending on what they actually do. So, you know, direct air capture or biochar will be quite expensive, and things like offsetting wood-based cooking methods in Africa will be less, and there'll be a gradient in between them.
Yeah, very interesting. Thanks, Paul. So I think I've been through all the questions, Barney, unless you can see anything else that I can't.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Marianne.
Okay, no problem. But no, thank you, Paul. Thanks, Tony, for making the time and doing this. It's very interesting talk. Again, thank you very much, Paul, for dialing in from Canada and making the effort. And thanks everyone who joined this webinar. It was great having you all here today. So as Barney already mentioned in the chat, the presentation will be available on SPE London website along with the recording. So yeah, you can have access to all those, I guess, shortly after we finish today.
Thanks for having us.
Yep, thank you very much.
Yeah, and thanks everyone from me too. That's been a great session. Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a good rest of the day.
All
Okay.
right.
Take
Cheers.
care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.